get Brexit done, to get Brexit done.
2, 1.
Five years since that moment, the UK flag was lowered from right here outside the EU Parliament, and Britain left the European Union. So, half a decade later, is there an answer to the question, is Brexit a success? How has it impacted both the UK and the EU? And what might change now that, for the first time in those 5 years, we have a Labour government in Britain, not a Conservative one? We'll be looking at all that and more on this special edition of Westminster Watch on the road in Brussels. So, joining me now is veteran journalist of the Brexit years, Tony Connolly. Tony, welcome. Thanks for joining us here in front of the European Parliament. Now, 5 years ago, when Brexit was formally declared, it was all over the news in Britain. Britain was consumed by it. What was it actually like here in the heart of Europe?
I remember the morning the vote came out and just the shock that people felt. I mean, people felt it would be a narrow victory for Remain. And then everyone was running around trying to understand exactly the implications for this. But it was a very disorientating, confusing and all-consuming time in those first months.
And we're now with a new government under Keir Starmer. He's looking to reset those relations between the UK and the EU. What do you think that's going to look like?
Yeah, I mean, as one diplomat said to me recently, it's like both sides are on the starting block for this reset, but nobody wants to run first. The EU is saying, well, Britain left and they want to get a closer relationship, so we need to hear from them what they want. So we know the general territory of what might be possible, but Keir Starmer hasn't really fully articulated how far he's willing to push some of those red lines. And if he stays out of the customs union and the single market, it's hard to see how there can be a massive dividend in terms of trade and access.
So one final question for you. Has Brexit, in any sense, been successful?
Well, it gives the UK a lot more leeway to make its own decisions in terms of foreign policy, in terms of trade. Whether it's been a financial success, I think that's going to be a longer question. And obviously, there are now very significant trade barriers between Britain and its natural customer base in the European Union. So that's bound to hurt. And of course, nobody anticipated a second Trump administration, and that's put both the EU and the UK on tenterhooks in terms of what tariffs he might apply, and that's really perhaps forced the UK to decide, is it going to be closer to the United States under Trump, or seek to re-seek a closer relationship with the EU?
Churchill's was directly affected by Brexit. Owner Phil Felsted struggled to maintain its character as a slice of the British pub culture here in Brussels.
It's more difficult to get some of our products, which we normally relied on, and we have some unique selling points through British products like snacks and beers. And that was all very difficult. And there was lots of delays and inconsistencies, and I was just having to explain to customers that owing to Brexit, we have to the products will be in as soon as we can get them.
Have things improved? Here we are, 5 years on. Is it looking better?
You can get beers and crisps again. Yes, you just have to kind of adjust and sidestep it, because you still need to find the products that you need for your customers.
So the new Labour government are talking about resetting relations with the EU. What would you like to see moving forward?
It was very difficult to hire British people now. I mean, I have a couple of students working here, they're on a student visa, I'm able to use them, or if they have a residency card, I'm able to do that. But after Brexit, I found myself fishing out of a much smaller pond when it came to being able to choose my staff. And I think that's opportunities for me lost and opportunities for people that want to travel and get a job. So yeah, a bit of more freedom of movement for people to come and work.
But what does someone who was actually on the UK side of the Brexit negotiations think? I'm dialing in former Conservative MP and Brexit Minister Steve Baker. Thanks for joining me here on Westminster Watch. And as you can see, I'm actually in Brussels, in the Churchill's, which is a British pub. And I'm with the owner here who tells me that he struggled to import his British beer and crisps in the immediate aftermath of Brexit. Now, that wasn't the intention, was it?
No, of course it wasn't. And I'm sorry that he had that trouble. I mean, certainly I want the free movement of goods and services, not just between the UK and Europe, but between the UK and the rest of the world. So it certainly wasn't my intention. And I hope that it was a transitional problem and it's now resolved itself.
The Brexit campaign did promise, however, that leaving the EU would lead to a better economy, control of our borders and an improved NHS. But has any of that been achieved?
Well, as a matter of fact, the extra money has gone to the NHS, but of course money to the NHS soon gets swallowed up. On migration, the issue of people coming across the Channel is not so much one of the EU, it's one of people breaking the law and then the case law of the ECHR getting in the way. Of course, the dominant factor in our economic history of the last few years is COVID. And I would encourage anyone to look at our GDP figures versus countries in Europe like Germany's, and they'll see that really it's very hard to stack up that leaving the EU did us any harm. But it's certainly true that there's a hell of a lot more to do.
Some parts of the Brexit deal still aren't fully implemented. You've got delays to new customs procedures at the UK's border with Northern Ireland, and there's still no agreement on post-Brexit arrangements for Gibraltar. That's a bit of a mess, isn't it?
I'm hugely disappointed at the overall handling of our leaving the EU. Gibraltar, of course, is always going to be contentious with Spain. Spain will always seek to recover Gibraltar. We will always refuse. But really, with goodwill, these things are technically easy to solve.
Steve, you mentioned goodwill. Now, with Labour talk of resetting relations with the EU, as a leading member of the Brexit campaign, does that worry you at all?
So what's happening here is that Labour are approaching the ordinary run-of-the-mill, but first review of the Trade and Cooperation Agreement. I don't think they're likely to achieve anything that's really dramatic. They can't possibly take us back into the customs union. I really don't think they can take us into the EEA. Although Keir Starmer would get whatever he wanted through the House of Commons, there's no doubt about that, it would just be seen as such a betrayal. And so I really think that the fundamental terms of our relationship with the EU won't change.
Is there anything you would actually like the Labour government to secure? Anything you think that was missing from the original Brexit deal?
Yeah, absolutely. Things like mutual recognition of professional qualifications, that should be an absolute no-brainer. Enabling touring bans to cross the Channel and go to any country in the European Union, again, should be a no-brainer. And these things really should have been agreed first time round. Honestly, I really regret that I was so junior throughout the whole thing, because I see now more clearly than ever that the combination of humility and resolve, which I was willing to bring to the negotiations, would have been the right way forward if we'd guaranteed citizens' rights with the humility to recognise their contribution to our country from the start, but the resolve to say we are now going to control migration, however. That combination of humility and resolve could have set us up for a far more successful and smooth exit.
Well, now we're going to hear from someone on the other side of the Brexit debate. I'm meeting with David McAllister MEP, who is chair of the Foreign Affairs Committee here in the European Parliament. Let's go back 5 years, 2019. Brexit officially happened and we went our separate ways. You have often described it as a lose-lose situation. Do you stand by that?
Oh, definitely. Even after 5 years, I simply don't find any positive aspect of Brexit at all. I think this was a historic mistake, but as a European Union, we had to accept the decision of our member state, the United Kingdom, to leave our family of nations. But since then, we are working on a positive agenda with the United Kingdom, and I think we have made some substantial progress over the last 5 years.
It was indeed quite a trying time, the negotiations, tensions were high and relationships suffered somewhat.
There are British ministers who look back and recognise that and say with some humility that they didn't handle things as well as they could. Do you think the EU has learnt lessons from what was a torturous Brexit process?
Well, I think we all had to learn a lot because we simply were all entering uncharted territory. There was the theoretical possibility of a member state leaving the European Union, but nobody really thought this would ever happen. But now with the withdrawal agreement, which has now been in place for 4 years, and the trade and cooperation agreement, which has been in place for 3 years, I believe that both agreements are a solid foundation for our relations. And as always in negotiations, both sides in the end had to find compromises.
The British Prime Minister, Keir Starmer, he says he wants what he describes as a reset of the relationship between the EU and the UK. How do you see that evolving?
We have a deal with the United Kingdom. The deal is the withdrawal agreement, including the Windsor Framework, and on the other hand, the trade and cooperation agreement. But still, both agreements are not fully implemented yet. And that's why we need to, first of all, focus on implementing what both sides have mutually agreed. There's still room for further negotiations. Defence and security, for instance, I think that's low-hanging fruit. Here, the United Kingdom, the European Union are like-minded partners. Here, we could really add something.
And when you look across the emerging electoral landscape coming up this year in Germany, for example, all indications are that there could be changes of government, and indeed there could be re-election of right-wing governments and the possibility of far-right politicians as well being part of those governments. Do you think that is laying the groundwork for more Brexit?
Well, if you look at the far right in Europe, even some of the very far right-leaning populist parties have changed their approach towards their own country leading the European Union. And I think one of the reasons is simply because Brexit wasn't a success story at all. You can see that it has a real negative impact for businesses and people if you leave the single market, if you leave the customs union, if you leave the European Union. For instance, the French nationalists of Madame Le Pen, they are much more cautious now in calling for France to leave the European Union. An exception is indeed the German Alternative für Deutschland. They also believe that Germany would be better off outside the European Union, but they are totally isolated in German politics. And one thing is guaranteed, the AfD will definitely not be part of the next German government, because all other political parties refuse to cooperate with these nationalists.
My next guest joined me in a studio in the heart of the EU Parliament. Welcome to former Conservative MEP Daniel Dalton, Finnish MEP Mika Aaltola, who is Vice Chair of the UK-EU delegation, and Anders Vistisen, Danish MEP and Chief Whip of the Patriots for Europe group. Now look, let's get to the heart of the matter. 5 years since Britain formally parted ways with the EU after Brexit. So has it been a success?
Well, I think it depends how you define what a success is, right? From a sort of sovereignty point of view, it's clearly been a success because the UK now has sovereignty. Effectively, it can do what it wants. The question, I think, is, you know, what have we done with it? You know, has it been a success from an economic point of view? Has it been a success from the new powers that we've had from Brexit? And I think, you know, 5 years on from Brexit, I'm not sure we can comfortably say it's been a success from that perspective.
Mika, what has it meant for the EU to lose what was the second biggest economic powerhouse to the EU and a major player?
Well, of course it was a major loss, and I come from the Scandinavian Nordic region, and we miss you there. We were like-minded in multiple issues like free trade, for example. But of course, things do happen, and now we are resetting the relationship, and nostalgia is not a forward-looking attitude. So now we have to deal with UK as a sovereign country.
Well, Anders, turning to you, I mean, economically, Europe's having a tough time, Britain's having a tough time. You know, I'm reminded when it comes to trade of the words of
Prime Minister Giorgia Meloni in Italy, when she actually said that the Americans innovate, China replicates, and the EU regulates, which might be part of the problem with growth. Do you actually think the answer to Britain's problems is to join a very regulator-orientated EU?
I think Britain should maybe decide whether they want to go out or go in. If they want to have some economical benefits, they clearly need to be in a place where they can deregulate. I think it's a very correct assessment that one of the major problems in Europe, and we've seen over the last 30 years that America has have a better growth rate. Even Japan, with their declining population, have a better growth rate. And I think one of the major problems we are having in Europe is overregulation. But as long as you are sort of more or less trapped in many of these, to follow that regulation, to be connected to the single market, you're caught between rock and a hard place, I think it's called.
Daniel, at the same point to you, though, really, because, you know, Prime Minister Keir Starmer, he said, look, we want to reset the relationship, but we're not going to join the customs union. We're not going to have freedom of movement. We're not going to join the single market. What can he possibly hope to gain out of a reset that remains a little undefined?
I mean, if you take the assumption that he's stuck with the sort of hard Brexit, if you want to call it a hard Brexit that we had up to now, so no single market, no customs union, there is still quite a lot that you could do within that. So, for example, the EU is asking for a mobility agreement. The UK is asking for recognition of professional qualifications, for example.
But the UK have said no to the youth mobility scheme.
They have for now, right? But
you don't believe it?
No, well, I'm of the view that I think, given the economic situation in the UK, given the political situation that the government also finds itself in the UK, I think they're going to gradually gravitate to the way to get growth is to have closer relations with Europe. So I think, although no one will admit it at the moment, that the subtext everywhere is actually this reset will be a little bit more than people think.
But in hindsight, I think there's one aspect which is mutually very important that should be part of this reset, and that's security. During the Brexit negotiation, this was sort of brushed over because we still hadn't seen the full-scale invasion of Ukraine. But now we're seeing that the only larger European economy that is continuing with a high level of support is actually in the UK to Ukraine. I think from a Nordic perspective, I think we have a great interest to have a much deeper security cooperation between the Baltic states, the Scandinavia, Netherlands and the UK being the sort of more hawkish countries regarding Russia, regarding the situation there. So I actually think here Britain has a little bit of an undervalued asset that you have still one of the largest military powers in Europe, but also you are quite good contributors to Ukraine, which cannot be said, for instance, about France, about Italy, about Spain. Denmark alone have contributed more than these three economies, which are the second, third and fourth largest economies of the European Union.
Mika, on security, it's clearly an issue, but it's also an issue that doesn't unite European member states, does it? There is not the same enthusiasm, unanimous enthusiasm, for example, to step up and support a peacekeeping force in Ukraine if President Trump is successful and gets his stated wish of peace there.
That's a European-wide problem. It's UK problem. It's everybody's problem. We do not have enough troops. It tells you something about the level of how we cast in on the peace dividend. Over the years, the money has disappeared.
Doesn't this strengthen the UK's hand?
Well, it does. It does, of course, the defence side. And that's in the UK delegation when we have been talking about the possible ways forward that are relatively apolitical. And defence happens to be one. And then besides that, there are obvious ways of proceeding in high-tech, in artificial intelligence, in quantum computing that are apolitical. They don't sound too European Unionists, so they don't kind of go above the threshold when they are maligned by the press, for example.
OK, but Anders, let me ask you this. The Europe and the member states we know now, that landscape could change over the coming year with elections in some member states. The right, and in some cases the far right, are on the rise. Do you think that voting for so-called pro-nationalist parties could lead to another Brexit?
I don't know of any European nations where major far-right or far-right parties are advocating an exit. So, but of course you will see a change in the political landscape if they win more elections. But I think also the question...
So you don't think Brexit 2 from another nation is on the cards? Is that, well, briefly, was that the EU's aim when they wanted to play very hard with the UK? They wanted to show that leaving the Union was not on.
Of course, that was some of the posturing, but I think there's the fundamental philosophical difference between the British self-understanding and the rest of us that also is politically a hindering block. I always said as a Dane, it's a little bit unfair because you invited us to the party. It was the Britain who got us into the European Union back in the day, and then you leave without us. But I think that the difference in mentality across the channel makes it unfeasible.
Well, from across the channel to across the Atlantic, Daniel, President Trump, he's threatening trade tariffs just about on anyone at the moment. Some leaders, the Prime Minister of Denmark, for example, are calling for the EU to show a united front and stand up to Trump. And they'd like the UK to be part of that. But my question to you is this. Prime Minister Keir Starmer, he thinks he can have it both ways. He can cosy up to Trump, get favourable trade terms there, and cosy up to the EU and get better terms here. But the problem there is President Trump doesn't think much of the EU, does he? Is it going to work?
I don't think it's going to work. I mean, to be fair, that's what UK Prime Ministers always try and do. We want one foot in the camp with the US, one foot with the camp with the EU. I think that's always been a traditional place where we would go.
Not always with President Trump's in power, though.
No, but I think you've got to look with what President Trump is doing is he's also talking about a big deregulation agenda and a big growth agenda. And I think that's actually what's going to have the real impact on Europe. Because if Europe doesn't deregulate, and I include the UK in this, and Trump is successful with that deregulation, the American economy grows, then Europe is facing almost an existential economic challenge, and so is the UK. So I think that is probably going to force Starmer, if he cannot do deals with the US, to start going a little bit closer to Europe as well.
Can we really expect any prospect of, shall we say, perhaps a more open-minded EU in the face of the international challenges Daniel has just outlined?
Clearly, you know, there's similarities. European Union is talking about deregulation, streamlining, saving costs here and there. So that's also on the European cards. It is in US, it is also affecting UK politics. So it's happening, there's a family resemblance there. We should open visions for the future that are kind of mutually agreeable. Baby steps first, perhaps, or like in the next meeting in a couple of months, but then seeing something much bigger looming in the horizon.
And as the strength of the EU is the size of the bloc, is enlargement the answer to, if you like, defending against some of the threats, economic and security, that the EU faces?
I think the security concerns, in my mind, is best addressed in NATO. I'm very happy that we now have Finland and Sweden as full members. I'm a little bit because we have this economical crisis also in Europe. We have very low growth rates. We have the problem of regulation. And unfortunately, with the countries who are aspiring to become member of the European Union, I don't see them as very free trade-loving countries. I don't see them as open market, free market economies. What we're talking about is the Western Balkan nations, Ukraine as a very, very big country, Moldova, and probably not Georgia anymore, but a couple of months ago there was also that aspiration. Most of these countries will not make a big difference because they're relatively small in comparison. The big question is Ukraine. That's 44 million people, a relatively big agrarian economy that will upset the internal market for farming, and also a relatively poor country, so it will mean that Finland and Denmark would have to contribute quite a lot more to the budget, even if we manage to reform it. So the big question here is in my mind, how far are we going with Ukraine? How fast? That is really the defining question.
Let me ask you, each of you, this final question. I'll start with you, if I may, Daniel. What do you think, succinctly as you can, is the future relationship likely to be between the UK and the EU?
Well, I think given all the challenges you've talked about, it's probably only going in one direction. Like the UK and the EU are going to be closer than they are today. Now, how far that goes, I think, is dependent on politics in the UK, on what the British government decides it needs to do in reaction to the economic challenges, political challenges it's got there. But I think almost certainly we're going to see a closer relationship than we've had over the last 3 or 4 years.
Would you welcome that?
From a Danish perspective, we would like the closest possible relationship. It was for us a big problem that UK left. Economically, we maintained our trade, but we would like to deepen the relationship. But it is a sovereign nation, so it also depends on the British people and the politicians that represent them.
Let me ask you the same question, but perhaps in a different way. What is the future for the EU going to be like if the UK does not form strategic military alliances or closer trading relationship?
Clearly, geopolitics is one of the main drivers in Europe right now, and that's one of the reasons why Ukraine, as the biggest military power in Europe, why it needs to be integrated. We need to stop complicating matters, and that is also the answer to the UK question. The defense of Europe, defense of democracies needs UK's role, and that defense side, when Americans are receding in the future, needs to be decided. And I see there kind of a grand vision emerging. We need UK in European defense and vice versa. So that's kind of the...
Mika, Anders, Daniel, thank you for joining us here on Westminster Watch. And thanks again to all my guests who have joined me for this special edition of Westminster Watch on the Road. Don't forget to also subscribe to the TRT World YouTube channel for more lively debate and conversation. But for me and the team, goodbye